Right now what we're trying to do is to find the inverse. You can find the inverse of an equation, or you can find the inverse of a graph. We're going to start by finding the inverse of an equation. My first example shows f of x is equal to 5x plus 2. Well, we know f of x is the exact same thing as y. So let me rewrite this equation and get it y equals 5x plus 2. The reason I did that is because the rule for finding the inverse is to switch x and y. That's a key phrase that, unless we're talking about matrices, which is a whole different kind of inverse, when we're talking about an equation or a graph, to find the inverse, you take your x and your y and you switch places. So what I'm going to do for my inverse is anytime I see a y, I'm going to make it an x. And anytime you see an x, I'm going to make it a y. So my inverse will be x equals 5y plus 2. Now please note, these equations are not equal to each other. They are completely different equations. One is the original function and one is its inverse. One way that I can show that is, although this is my answer, this is not in proper math etiquette form. And proper math etiquette form would be that I rewrite it as a y equals equation. So I still have a couple more steps to do. I have my answer. That is my inverse. But I need to rewrite it and solve for y. So let's do that. We'll subtract 2 from both sides. And then I just have to divide both sides by 5. Now, these will cancel, and I am left with a y equals x minus 2 all over 5. 1, my answer's sloppy. 2, it's another etiquette thing. It would be nice if I have the y on the other side. But 3, having an answer of y equals is not very telling. It does not tell me if that's my equation, if that's my inverse. The equation was f of x originally. So we're going to use proper notation to demonstrate that this answer is my inverse. So instead of saying y equals, I'm going to say inverse of f of x. That's how we write that. Inverse of f of x is equal to, what do I have? X minus 2 over 5. And that is my final answer. So let's try another one. Let f of x be x plus 3 squared. All right, well, let's rewrite this. Y equals x plus 3 squared. For the inverse, what do? I switch x and y. So x equals y plus 3 squared. Okay, got it? But I have to write it in the proper etiquette form, y equals. Oh boy, this is a tough one because I have a squared here. And I also am going to have to subtract 3, but I also have to get rid of the squared. The big question is which comes first. I have to work from the outside in. I have to take care of this squared before I can subtract 3. The inverse of a squared is a square root. To take care of or get rid of that squared, I have to take the square root of both sides. I'll use red. So what I'm going to do is I am going to take the square root of both sides. The square root of something squared, they cancel each other out. And I am left with just y plus 3. You can have parentheses or not have parentheses. Not important. But here's the key. And I brought this up in class. I'm going to bring this up again here. It is very important for you to remember, when you take the square root of both sides, it was not given to you as a square root. You physically yourself had to take the square root of both sides. You must remember to not lose potential answers. So what I have to do is write plus or minus the square root of x. Whenever you take the square root of both sides, you must have that plus or minus right there. Now, what's my next step? To solve for y, I have to subtract 3. Be very careful. This, whoop, that should have been an x. is not really the most appropriate way to write this, because sometimes we get a little lazy and we draw our square root symbol and we fling it off and we're not sure if the 3 is under the square root or not under the square root. So because of that, it's best to write it like this. When I bring it over, it's a -3. It's appropriate to write it first and then write plus or minus the square root of x. I know that one's not too fun. Now, on the other side, I could write y, or I could write my appropriate notation and say inverse of f of x. And this wonderful, fun answer is my solution. Yay! Some of them are a little weird, and it'll be okay. We just keep plugging through. However, there's a second type of question that you're going to be asked, and that is find the inverse of a graphed function. Actually, most of the time, you're going to be asked to graph the function, and then on top of that, graph its inverse, just like I have here. Graph the function and its inverse. How do we do that? Well, hopefully by now you know how to graph the function. Then, to graph the inverse, we're going to find 3 points on the function and then switch x and y. So let's work through that and see what I'm talking about. Okay, I want to graph f of x equals x plus 1 squared plus 3. Well, we know f of x is equal to y. Okay, so y equals x plus 1 squared plus 3. What's the vertex? Or what is my starting point? Bad teenager analogy. In the house you do the opposite, outside the house you don't. So -1, +3 is my vertex. What shape am I going to graph? Let's see, you think about that while I plot the vertex. -1, 1, 2, 3. All right, we have a squared, and a squared is a parabola, a U shape, yes. So, we are going to need 3 points. I have 1. And what I'm going to do is on the other side, I'm going to write inverse. Because I don't need to know the inverse of that equation. What I just did earlier was when I was asked to find the inverse of the equation. I wasn't asked that. I was just asked to graph this and then graph the inverse. So I don't need a new equation. I need 3 points on this one, and then I need to switch the x and the y so that I can find the inverse. If this is a parabola, the inverse will also be a parabola. We'll get to that in a moment. My new vertex will be to take the old vertex and switch x and y. Signs go with the numbers. So a -1, 3 becomes a 3, -1. Okay, but I'm not going to plot that just yet because I want to go and get my other 2 points first. As I mentioned, I'm going to have a parabola. It's going to open up. It starts at -1, 3. I need 2 more points. And as some notes we did in class today, actually, was that to graph more properly a parabola, what I can do is just go up 1 over 1. And there's the second point. And you know a parabola is symmetrical. Same thing on both sides. So I'm going to go up 1 and to the left 1. And I just found 2 more points. And then, of course, when I connect them, I'm not going to connect them like a V. I'm going to connect them like a U with a curve. But let's find those points first. This is the point 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is the point -2, 1, 2, 3, 4. And when I graph them, I graph a curve. And that's not my best, but, you know, we'll work with it. All right? And there's my parabola. Graph the function. Done. And on top of I could have graphed it faster, but I really wanted to find these 2 extra points. Why? Because my next part says I also have to graph its inverse. To do that, find 3 points on the function. I've got those. switch x and y. Okay, for my inverse, the vertex was negative 1, 3. So my vertex of my new graph will be 3, negative 1. 0, 4 is on my function. So on my inverse, I will have 4, 0. Negative 2, 4 is on my function. On the inverse, I will have 4, negative 2. Plot the points. 3, 1. 1, 2, 3. Sorry, negative 1. 3, negative 1. 4, 0. 1, 2, 3, 4. 0. And by the way, this first one was a vertex, so I'm going to put a little V next to it just so I remember. 4, 0, I plotted that point. 4, negative 2 is right here. Now you remember, the inverse of a parabola is another parabola. This is my vertex, so draw your parabola. It's going to go sideways, and it's a very ugly parabola, but that's okay. Ugly is not, we're not looking for pretty, we're looking for accuracy. But there you go. I have now graphed them. I put some notes on here also. Something I've already talked about. To graph a parabola, plot the vertex, we did that, and then move up 1 and out 1 for your next 2 points. I started with the vertex and I went up 1 and out 1 for my other 2 points. I hope this helps. For all of these questions, you'll graph the initial function and then find 3 points. That starting point is always a good one to have, that are on this graph, and then you can just switch the x and y and easily graph its inverse. All right, good luck.